everybody. Thank you for having come to this presentation. It's really a big pleasure to have Professor Rodrigo Garrido from University, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but Diego Portales?
Perfect.
Okay. Dean of the College of Engineering, who has agreed to come and visit us to give a presentation titled Freight Demand Forecasting, Some Theoretical and Practical Perspectives. I'm just introducing here the presentation as Director Pro Tempore of CREI, because hopefully I will be changing this position, finishing this position in a short while. It has been 4 years long. And the discussion after the presentation will be Antonio Comi from the Faculty of Engineering, again from Roma, Tor Vergata, okay? There was a problem with the, with the brochure of the conference. So, thank you, Rodrigo, very much for having agreed to give us this presentation, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo.
Okay. Yes, we take the switch the
first of all, well, thank you, Eduardo, for having me here. I would like to know the background is political sciences, economics.
Just one political science, one economist, two economists. All the others are. There are two engineers here, one statistician and another economist.
Also, there's no average.
No, very scattered.
So, yeah.
But everybody is interested in freight.
Okay, I will speak about probably the more sort of the more general aspects of the models that I will present, and if you have deeper questions in terms of methodological or analytical things, we could go down deeper. Okay, so when people talk about transportation, they usually talk about the movement of people. Movement of people is very important, as you know, but it's not as important as the movement of commodities or freight within a country. That is because of the impact that the movement of freight has on the GDP, gross domestic product. There has been a lot of ways of understanding the movement of freight, most of them from the perspective of an equilibrium between demand and supply. And the problem with this approach in freight is that you don't have the data or the frameworks to put the data into to get this equilibrium and go forth with the analysis. And unfortunately, the growth in freight transportation has been so big that the modeling abilities that we have to deal with it are insufficient to predict what's going on with movements of freight. The movements of freight are actually sort of a great predictor of the GDP. If you don't know what's going to happen with your movement of commodities and products in a country, you don't know the GDP of that country. So that's the bottom line. So we need to rethink the forecasting paradigms that we use to forecast and predict the movement of goods. There has been a few publications trying to divide transportation, freight transportation models into different categories. One of the categories that are usually divided into are international, regional, and urban. Within those, there are two kinds of models. Models that try to analyze how vehicles move in space, and other models are interested in how commodities move from the place of production to the place of consumption. Well, and there's a new type of model I wouldn't say model, I'd say actually it's a modeling framework. It is called agent-based. It's heavily based on behavioral issues in economics, which is now one of the trends in economics, as you may know, that more than looking what's going on at a broad level, we look into what's going on with the preferences of people and how people react to different options that they have. So that's the agent-based part, which will be the last part of my talk. I'm not going to go into details of these, but these are different international models. Some of them, you as economists probably know the input-output matrix, which explains the degree of relation between a separate set of goods that the economy has. For instance, the Chilean economy has divided the 72 different commodities. So what's the, for one commodity, how much money sells to another commodity? Let's say oil to transportation, oil to mining, oil to whatever, and so on and so forth. So if you have that matrix, you sort of have a sense of what's going on with elasticity of consumption and production between different sectors of the economy. So if you can relate that relation to the consumption, you have a model that is more based on behavior than saying, if I have 200 trucks or trains with freight every year, I have the GDP and the increase of GDP 5%, so the trucks and trains will increase in 5%. That's more observational. This is more based on general behavior of the consumers. There are other models that we developed in the beginning of the 21st century, actually. So they're rather old now, but at the time they were interested in the sense that the movements of freight are heavily correlated with spatial connectivity and the temporal activities of people. The problem with this type of models is that it's extremely extensive in the use of data, extremely complicated from the mathematical perspective if you want to put them analytically. Intercity models, there are a few of them, and perhaps the most common are time series models, which are not behavioral in a sense. So a time series model says, if you're driving your car and you look through your rear mirror, whatever you see in your rear mirror will be in the next meters that you travel in your car. And that's good if you're in a straight highway, you know, you will do the same. But as soon as you have a turn, the model crashes, as well as your car, of course. So that's one of the problems, and some of them are based on the utility maximization theory. Utility not in the von Neumann Morgenstern style, but in the Daniels-McFadden random utility models. He actually won the Nobel Prize for that model, in which says that people act in terms of maximizing their utility, and so they use or they choose the transportation mode which maximizes their utility. The problem with that is that when I travel, for instance, from the hotel to this university, the utility is sometimes based in other aspects. If it wasn't raining, I wouldn't have taken a taxi, probably would have taken a bus or take a walk or whatever. So it is very difficult to isolate what's in your utility function to be maximized. So there's another family of models which are activity-based models that says people choose transportation modes in terms of what are the activities that they have to do in the day. You have to, if I had to take my kid to the school and then go to work and then go to the gym, probably I will, would use the car. But if I simply go from my house to downtown to work and then downtown home, I will probably take the metro or a bus. So the activities are the primary drivers of mode choice and not the per se utility that Daniel McFadden thought. It is still a very nice theory, and he won the Nobel Award for that, so it's valuable, but sometimes it's not very useful. Urban models are a bit more complicated because at your urban model you have all these intricate things that have congestion, different modes like train, cars, taxi, buses, limos, bicycles, and interacting together. You can ride your bike and park your bike at the metro station and then take the metro, and then you can walk. That interacts with trucks that are trying to park in illegal spaces. All the cities in the world, the trucks park in illegal spaces, because otherwise we would pay much more for any wood that we can buy. It would be very expensive because they have to pay for the proper parking. So in urban systems it's more complicated. This is a very complicated model. As you can imagine, it goes from the input-output matrix of an economy, which is the Italian economy. How the Italian economy complete goes down to what I do as an urban movement. That's a highway that you have to travel from up down to the bottom line. There are simple models like linear regression, but as we know, linear regression is always wrong because nothing is linear here. So you can see some points and draw a line, but doesn't mean anything because life is not linear. So the point is that we have a lot of models. All of them are wrong, but some are worth and some are not. We have to understand that any model, analytical or whatever, that we use is wrong in the sense that it doesn't depict the whole reality. It leaves things out and we have to live with that. But we have to be smart enough to leave out of the model only the portion that is not relevant to a specific issue that we're trying to deal with. And if we don't fulfill the assumptions that the models have, the model will probably be wrong, and that's one of the problems with linear regression models. Linear regressions have a lot of constraints that have to be fulfilled, otherwise they don't work. So what's the trade-off practice now more than theoretical? In practice, what I did to see what's going on with practice, I took the most recent studies in Europe and the US. They don't look very recent, but that's the most recent compendium of models that we have in Europe and the US. And surprisingly enough, both studies made from different people, different countries, different times, sort of have the same issues across the board. So they arrive to some classifications. Trends models. That simply say if the GDP trend is, I don't know, growing 2% per year, or if we have a recession or whatever, try to predict that trend in the model. So if you have 1,000 trucks per day, increase that number according to the GDP trend. Very simple. Time series. Look through the mirror. And if you want to do it more complicated, use a vector instead of a scalar time series. Namely, use several variables correlated with each other in time. So that means look not only through your car's window, through your neighbor's car's windows, and you will see a better picture of what's going on. System dynamics. This is complicated analytically. You can pretty much, as in physics, establish a set of equations. Is a system of very complicated equations that will explain the movement of a system that is very, very narrowed in the sense that you leave out many aspects that cannot be modeled continuously. And as we know, life is discrete. You either come here or you don't come, but you don't come 20%, and the 80% of that is in the cafeteria. So these models work with physics, like forces and stuff like that, and the dynamics of electricity or something like that, but not necessarily with people who make decisions for freight or transportation in general. The other very useful for general purposes type of models is zonal trip rates. You divide the city of Rome in different zones, let's say 1,000 zones for Rome, and say in this zone the rate of production of trips of trucks with merchandise is 2.5%. In this zone is 3.7%, etc., etc. So with these zonal rates, you can draw what's going to happen at the Rome level if you aggregate all of them. That's very used for the government. In the US, the government has actually a manual of how to do this, how to create the zones, how to use the rates. For instance, a supermarket will have a very definite rate of receiving produce, receiving frozen food, receiving electronics, whatever. So you use that rates to project what's going on. As you see, it's not related to anything in economics or behavior. It's just numbers that you observe historically. And of course, the input-output is always present. The input-output must be present because there is a relation between all the different products in the economy, and this computer needs a lot of other things to be put together. So the relation between electronics and other products or sectors in the economy must be taken care of somehow. And so that's why both in Europe and the US, those analyses are always present.
But,
yes.
sorry, input-output matrices at urban level?
That's a very good question. It's always at national level, and are ways to regionalize that. And the way that at least we have done it and some other publications, you take the national matrix and say, okay, national matrix is probably, I don't know in Italy, but probably computed and recomputed every 10 years or so.
Yeah.
So you have two problems. First, you have to take the newest matrix, which probably is, I don't know, from 2009, and bring it back to 2013. So there are ways to make an update of that with economic indicators. Once you have it in the time that you need to go down different levels of aggregation. So there are some economic indicators of the activity at zonal level or sometimes at municipalities or slower divisions that you may have. So the totals are regularly measured. For instance, the total amount of products sold in supermarkets is recorded in an indicator. For instance, every month the Association of Commercial Distributors have an indicator of how much money people spend on supermarkets at this municipality. So that's the number that you have to match with all the sectors that sell to supermarkets. So you go down from the national to the more disaggregate level using those indicators. And then you have several small matrices that if you add them together should go to the national, which is a huge endeavor, by the way. There's not always data available, and the data are from different times, different pieces, but it can be done. So what is missing in practice? There's an author, Etches, in 71 said that the ideal freight transportation model should have at least 4 important ideas present in them. First of all, strong behavioral foundation. None of the models that I have mentioned before have a strong behavioral foundation. Why? Because they are so difficult from the analytical perspective that adding an extra level of behavioral, as the way we think, we react, we have our perceptions, whatever, is very complicated. Multimodal scope, most of them deal with many modes, namely transportation modes, trains, bus, trucks, whatever, barge. They have to treat passengers and freight simultaneously. Very few models that I know of deal with both passengers and freight. The streets in Rome perhaps are used by minivans, trucks, small trucks, cars, and some of them are carrying commodities like electronics, for instance. Some of them are carrying people, but they both share the same infrastructure. The standard procedure in transportation is to deal with freight on one side, passengers from another side. And when you deal with passengers, you assume that there is a fixed proportion of freight movement in the network using a small portion of capacity, and the rest of the capacity is used for passengers. And if you go the other way, you assume that passengers are a fixed number of trips in the network, and so on and so forth. But there's of course an interaction between them, and the way drivers behave when you have an 18-wheeler truck aside, it's different than when you have a motorino or whatever. So behaviorally, it's different. They have to be sensitive to policy changes. Some of them are, especially those based on input-output matrices or more complicated econometric models, can be sensitive to policy changes. I mean, if you change the taxes, how that affects the movement of freight or people. But as I put here in white, those are probably the weakest parts of the chain. And what I would like to talk a little bit about, not this, but this part, the strong behavioral foundation, which is more economical, sociological, and sometimes psychological, that if we try to incorporate everything in an econometric model, it would be impossible to calibrate and to estimate. So, one of the temptations of using behavioral models in freight is to use what is called the 4 steps model, or the 4 stages model, sometimes it's called, which is used for passengers. The 4 steps are the generation of trips, the distribution of trips. Generation is how much trips come out of a school every morning, a hospital, a university, whatever. Distribution, from what point of the city to what point of the city these trips are done. And then the third one would be modal choice. Do they travel by car, by bus, by metro? And finally, to assign those trips, if you go from your home to the university using a car, what route do you use to get to the university? That's the 4th step. And that's the more advanced behavioral scheme that has been used for passenger transportation. It's been around probably from the 60s or 70s, and it's been used from decades, and everyone agrees that that's a good model for passengers, and probably is to some extent. But the problem when you try to use the same model for freight are enormous. So we don't support the idea of using the four-step model for freight for many reasons, and let's see some of these reasons. First of all, you have on the left-hand side a personal travel sort of chain. H is for home. You go from home to work, work to lunch, lunch to work, work to gym, gym to shopping, shopping home. That's a typical day of somebody. So you can come in if you want.
It's free.
It's free, yeah. And it's interesting. Well, so this is sort of a linear set of decisions that one person makes. If I'm not feeling very well today, I'm not going to the gym. If I'm in the mood, I'll take a long lunch. If I have things to do, I will just take a very brief lunch, or not going shopping, whatever. Those are the decisions that I make. So I decide my transportation mode, how much time I spend in each activity. So that's the behavioral aspect that I have to deal with. This is a simplified, very simplified way of how freight is decided, freight movement. So you have a supply chain in which you have raw material, different plants produce, let's say, cement and bricks and tiles and whatever. So they go to distribution centers, different distribution centers across the country. The plant is run by some people, the distribution center is run by other people. Those distribution centers go to corporate wholesalers which have their own distribution centers somewhere else. Perhaps this is in Asia and this is in Italy. Also, you have distributors that are different from corporate wholesalers. Distributors do not belong to the same company. There's no vertical integration here. So you have other distributors. And those distributors go to the retail stores, supermarkets, shopping malls, whatever. All of these have different people making decisions. Each one of them want their own good, so there's no single person making any decision here. People making decisions here change over time, and they fight each other for decisions. So modeling this from the behavioral perspective is a mess. So nobody does that. And some people have tried to incorporate that in econometric models, and it's very complicated. So that's one of the things that we have to bear in mind. I don't know if you're familiar with the gravity models. Gravity models work fairly well for passengers. You have origins, vertical, and destinations, horizontal. So I have zeros here. I could have some other numbers, but let's assume that zones are very small, so you don't have travels from zone A to zone A, B, B, etc. So these are the totals and totals. You use a gravity model, which is, let's say, is a mathematical function to describe this. And the standard interpretation is that you have that number, for instance, from A to B, you have 120 trips. So the A to B and B to E would spend $3,000 or whatever. You have here $200 and $150 from A to all of the other possibilities.